version of Mr. Stanton's biography, or do I do the condensed version?
Oh, it must be the long version.
You're George.
Oh,
Go ahead. You
Okay.
can.
he deserves
Yes.
the long version. Yes.
Thank you, because Mr. Robert G. Stanton, former senior advisor to the Secretary of the United States Department of Interior and former director of the National Park Service, is a consultant and lecturer in natural and cultural resource preservation, park management, and diversity. Appointed by President Barack Obama in 2014, he is a former expert member of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and independent federal agency. The ACHP promotes the educational, economic, and cultural values of historic preservation and advises the President and Congress on national historic preservation policy. It also influences federal activities, programs, and policies that affect historic and cultural properties. He was the chairman of the ACHP Communications, Education, and Outreach Committee. As senior advisor to the Interior Secretary from 2010 to 2014, Mr. Stanton served as a key senior analyst and provided expert legal advice and support to the Secretary on a wide range of environmental, educational, organizational, and management challenges and opportunities, and worked closely with the bureaus and offices in advancing the Secretary's and the President's goal for the Department of the Interior. He also represented the Secretary and the Department on the Presidential Policy Review and the President's goals for DOI. He also represented the Secretary and the Department on the Presidential Policy Review committees, boards, and commissions. And from 2009 to 2010, before assuming the senior advisor position in the immediate office of the Secretary, Mr. Stanton served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Program Management. Following his 35-year career with the National Park Service, he returned to federal service in 2009 and served as an executive professor at Texas A&M University in the Department of Recreation, Park, and Tourism Sciences, visiting professor at Howard University in the Department of History, the Public History Program, professor of practice at Yale University in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and as a board member and consultant to a number of national conservation organizations. From 2001 to 2003, he served as the International Union for Conservation and Nature Ambassador for the 5th World Parks Congress, which took place in 2003 in Durban, South Africa. As an experienced public administrator, Mr. Stanton was nominated by President Bill Clinton and was unanimously confirmed in 1997 as the 15th director of the National Park Service and served as the director until the end of the Clinton administration. It should be noted that Mr. Stanton was the first and only African-American director of the National Park Service. He was the first director to also undergo confirmation hearings before the Senate since the National Park Service was established in 1916. Beginning with his appointment by Interior Secretary Stuart Lee Udall in 1962 as a seasonal park ranger at the Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming, Mr. Stanton has dedicated his life's work to improving the preservation and management of the nation's rich and diverse natural and cultural resources. He worked consistently to increase youth participation in conservation programs, and diversity in the workforce and public programs. He supported the establishment of new parks and programs that recognize the struggles, courage, leadership, and contributions of women and minorities in the development and collective history of the United States. He has also held key management and executive positions, including Park Management Assistant, National Mall and Memorial Parks, Washington, D.C., Park Superintendent, National Capital Parks East, Washington, D.C. and Maryland, Park Superintendent, Virgin Islands National Park, St. John's, U.S. Virgin Islands, Deputy Regional Director, Southeast Region in Atlanta, Georgia, Deputy Regional Director, National Capital Region in Washington, D.C., Regional Director, National Capital Region, Washington, D.C., and in the national office as Assistant Director for Natural Resources, Assistant Director for Park Operations, Associate Director for Park Management, and as the Director of the National Park Service. As the Director of the NPS, Mr. Stanton had policy, planning, and management responsibility for the National Park System's 384 natural, cultural, and recreation areas, and partnerships with governmental and non-governmental organizations. The 83 million acre national park system attracted 228 million visitors each year. He managed a workforce of 20,000 permanent, temporary, and seasonal employees and an annual budget of $2.3 billion. He was responsible for the NPS areas and offices located in 49 states, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Mr. Stanton's bipartisan and inclusive approach to problem solving and cooperative resource stewardship earned him respect and admiration, enabling him to build effective relations with the U.S. Congress, federal, tribal, state, and local agencies, diverse organizations, leaders, and citizens. Under his leadership and through the work of an outstanding staff, volunteers, and wide range of partners, the NPS budget increased by 28%, and major park preservation and visitor service programs were inaugurated. These included the Natural Resources Challenge, a major action plan for revitalizing and expanding NPS natural resource programs, the Cultural Resource Challenge, connecting people to parks through education and interpretation, the Public Land Court Program, Action Plan for Diversity in Workforce and Public Programs, co-sponsorship of the Save America's Treasures Program, the Visitor Transportation Systems, the Cultural Resources Diversity Intern Program, the Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit Program, or better known as the CESU program, international cooperative agreements for resource conservation, the restructuring of NPS planning, design, and construction program. Major administrative and legislative initiatives were enacted through his tenure, including the authorization of 2 new park areas, 6 national heritage areas, and the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom and special resources studies for 22 possible new areas to the national park system. He's been cited in a wide range of news media, professional and technical publications, and is a frequent public speaker. Mr. Stanton has participated in major national and international conferences, including the 5th World Parks Congress in Durban, South Africa, in 2003, World Protected Areas Leadership Forum in Switzerland, 2003, and in Australia in 2002, and in Spain in 2001, and in Virginia in 2000. The first World Conference on Cultural Parks, Merced Verde National Park, Colorado in 1984, and the second World Congress on National Parks at Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming in 1972. And he's the co-founder of the World Protected Areas Leadership Forum. He's active in professional and civic affairs. Current and past board and advisory council memberships include the Endangered Species Coalition, the Chesapeake Conservancy, Park Institute of America, Institute for Parks at Clemson University, Parks Preservation and Public Spaces Task Force of the U.S. Quincennial Commission, the Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools Park Campaign, the Advisory Council of the National Trust for Historic Preservation's African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, the National Parks Conservation Association, the Environmental Law Institute, the Grand Tetons National Park Foundation, the African American Experience Fund of the National Park Foundation, of which he was the co-founder, the Advisory Council of Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, the American Academy for Park and Recreation Administration, Guest Services, Inc., and the Student Conservation Association. Mr. Stanton has been nationally recognized through awards and citations for outstanding public service and leadership in conservation, historic preservation, youth programs, public and government relations, and diversity in employment and public programs. Recognition includes the U.S. Presidential Rank Award for Distinguished Federal Executive Service, the Distinguished Service Award, U.S. Department of Interior, the Distinguished Service Award, National Council of Negro Women, the International Salute Award in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and for work in keeping the dream alive, International Salute Committee, the Cornelius Pugliese Gold Medal, the American Academy for Park and Recreation Administration, the Student Conservation Association Founders Award, the Presidential Award, Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association, the Lincoln Medal, Ford's Theater Society, the Colonel Charles Young Diversity Recognition Award, the National Park Foundation Living Legacy Award, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Louise DuPont Crown and Shield Award, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and 2 awards and 1 joint award have been established in his name. Mr. Stanton has earned a Bachelor's of Science degree from Huston-Tillotson University in Austin, Texas, and did his graduate work at Boston University in Boston, Massachusetts. And he's been awarded 5 honorary doctorate degrees, Doctor of Letters, Texas A&M University, College Station, Texas, Doctor of Science, Huston-Tillotson University, Austin, Texas, Doctor of Environmental Stewardship, Unity College in Unity, Maine, Doctor of Public Policy, Southern University, and Agricultural Mechanical College in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Doctor of Science, North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. A native of Fort Worth, Texas, Mr. Stanton grew up in Moselle Valley during the era of the separate but equal. And this is one of the oldest communities in Texas, founded by African Americans shortly after the US Civil War. He and his wife, Janet, of I believe, of South Carolina, make their home in Fairfax Station, Virginia. And I might also add that Mr. Stanton was a mentor to my late brother, Mariba McDonald, helping him to become one of the first African-American professionals in the Cultural Resource Directorate at the Washington headquarters office in the National Park Service during the 90s. And he was also recognized as one of the 100 greatest members of Omega Psi Phi fraternity. So without further ado, my mentor, Mr. Robert G. Stanton.
Thank you very much, George, for that very kind and very gracious introduction. Let me hasten to thank our founders, our distinguished founders of the Green and Youth Foundation for their leadership, their contribution, and certainly for inviting me to have this great opportunity to interact with my fellow interns, because all of us are interns, all of us are students, in hope that we'll continue to develop and continue to learn. But there's no way really I can commend you for your leadership and your dedication. There's nothing more important than promoting the development of the most important resource of any nation, and that's its youth, our youth. So again, I want to commend the interns individually and collectively for your commitment to contributing to the preservation of our rich and diverse natural and cultural heritage. And in doing so, we honor our ancestors, and we all should always should be grateful for the contributions that those have made before us. I too want to join with Angelo and James in applauding, and certainly Ms. Bradley, Ms. Hamilton, and others, in applauding the recipients of the distinguished awards. Many of I know, Ms. Nance at Fort Monroe, and certainly Vance at the Southeast Regional Office in Atlanta. But I would just pause to applaud the young lady, the intern who received the award in the honor and memory of Iantha Gant Wright. As I listened to Angela and James and George and others, they epitomizes the enduring spirit of Maya Angelou as represented through the spirit of Iantha Gant Wright. She was a living poet because she walked in beauty, and she expressed with eloquency, and she dignified and elevated the work that each of us are pursuing on this noble journey of preserving our collective heritage. I would hope that each of you would take time to read the biography of Iantha Gant Wright and be inspired by her work that hopefully we have and continue to embrace, because she left us a rich and enduring legacy. So again, on behalf of all whom you have touched, I salute the founders of the Green and Youth Foundation. I salute the interns and your respective HBCUs. But I too want to congratulate and commend a young executive whom I have observed almost 20 years, and you know him by George McDonald. George is a hero to all of us because George has learned early on how to successfully navigate the bureaucracy and Interior, the Park Service, and all of the other bureaus within that department are in fact bureaucratic in their approaches occasionally. But George has never wavered from his commitment to deliver financial support, technical support, and personal guidance to the engagement of our young people throughout the breadth of the programs of the National Park Service. And George is sought by other federal agencies in terms of how they can structure, how they can engineer, how they can manage, how they can direct, and how they can fund similar programs. And he's no stranger throughout the breadth of not only the interior, but indeed all of the federal government. So George, as an illustrious graduate of the other H, I saw the in-house joke both between Hampton and Howard, but George is an illustrious graduate of Hampton University in Hampton, Virginia. So George, on behalf of all of us, again, congratulations on your leadership, and we commend you for your stewardship of our cultural and natural resources, but most importantly, your unwavering support of our youth. And for that, George, we shall remain grateful. I know that George has a few questions on behalf of the interns and the staff that he may want to raise with me. But let me also suggest, as we enter into some discussions, that we be mindful of the road for which our ancestors and for which we are traveling. Mr. Douglas reminded us, don't judge me by the height to which I've risen, but rather from the depth from which I've come. And that has given us all strength to know from which we've come and know that others have paved the way for us to reach the platform where we exist today. And as we go forward, let us always be grateful for the contributions of those who have brought us thus far. I recall sitting in the auditorium, branch auditorium on the campus of Houston-Tillotson. I must have been sophomore or junior. And one of my favorite instructors was Dr. James Means, a math instructor. And he made a comment referencing the sentiment that were echoed by Isaac Newton at the time that, pardon me, that he was about to be knighted by the Queen of England for his many discoveries in the scientific arena, particularly the theory of gravity. And it's said that Isaac Newton responded, pardon me, that if I have seen further, it was because I stood on the shoulders of giants. That is the origin of the expression. So I would ask that we recommit ourselves of being respectful and being grateful for our parents, our grandparents, great-grandparents, members of our communities, the leadership of our HBCUs, and all those who have struggled from 1619 to where we are today. Let us always be grateful. For it has been suggested, let gratitude be a part of our every thought and action. So I'm grateful to you. You are part of me, and I am a part of you. George, you have a few questions.
Yes, and thank you again, Mr. Stanton, just for your incredible leadership and the fact that you've unretired, I believe, 3 or 4 times.
Last time I checked the report card, George, on my 3rd retirement, the best I'm able to do at this point in time is an F-. I'm flunking it too, George.
Yes. So over the last 4 or 5 years, we've witnessed an awakening of young Black voices demanding equity and fair treatment on a wide range of issues. And when you were a young man in college and beginning your career in the National Park Service, there were some young people who were also demanding to be heard, people like John Lewis, Marion Barry, Jim Clyburn, and others. How did you balance your personal desire for social, racial, and economic justice with your ambition to serve our country through the National Park Service?
Thank you very much, George. That question calls for some reflection on my part, obviously. But as I reflect on the beginning of my career with the National Park Service, beginning with a seasonal appointment following my junior year at Grand Teton National Park, I had to reflect on those who have been what I often refer in the vineyard of struggling for equality, dignity, and justice. And I grew up in an area of separate but equal, a doctrine coming out of the Plessis versus Ferguson case in 1896 that was rendered by the US Supreme Court as being constitutional. Candidly and frankly, one of the most insidious doctrine handed down by the Supreme Court, save the Dred Scott decision, if you will. So as I was offered the opportunity to be one of the first African-Americans to work as a seasonal ranger in our parks 2 years before the Civil Rights Act of '64, I reflected on the courage of college students from HBCUs years before in terms of arguing for equality. I thought immediately of 4 freshman students from North Carolina A&T in Greensboro who had the courage to sit at the Woolworth bus counter to be served. And that kicked off throughout all of HBCUs, a reaction of students to lead protests for the desegregation of public accommodations. So again, when I was offered the opportunity to go to Grand Teton National Park, there was some intimidation or some trepidation because it was a new venture. But I thought about those who had the courage to lead to where we were in 1962. So as I entered the ranks of the Park Service, and make a long story short, going from Teton in '62 to ultimately stepping down as the 15th director in 2001, there were opportunities available to me to also contribute in my work capacity towards dignity and justice and freedom. And then also as a private citizen, I had the opportunity and indeed the obligation to acquaint my family, my fellow students, about the role and the responsibility of the Park Service, and that they should maybe argue that the Park Service be more responsive to preserving our collective heritage, be more responsive to hiring more African Americans in the workforce. So it was a balance between trying to contribute to the struggle of those in the past and those in the current situation, as well as trying to influence in my official role from a seasonal ranger to the director, that the National Park Service had a responsibility to respond to the interests and the needs of all America. I could not take a passive role in that respect. So I would just encourage the interns, as you look at your efforts to pursue a career either in the private sector or in the public sector, whatever your employer's business is about, try to make sure that their business activities are responsive to the broader spectrum of the American people. And that you as a private citizen, as you engage in your respective community organizations, try to do your best to contribute to furthering justice and freedom and dignity on the part of all of us. So you cannot leave your responsibilities at the door as you leave the office, or you cannot leave them in your community as you enter the door of your office. You are to be a responsible citizen 24/7. And that was the pledge of our ancestors. That should be our pledge as well.
It's powerful. Please share your early experiences in the National Park Service during the 60s and the 70s, and your role with the development of the urban parks movement and the National Park Service, and your relationship with former National Park Service Director George Herzog.
Thank you very much, George. Let me just recap a little bit about the comments you made in the earlier question. You spoke of some of the dynamic young leaders, such as John Lewis and Marion Barry, whom I had the opportunity to work with when he was the mayor of the District of Columbia, and certainly with Congressman John Lewis, served with distinction as a member of Congress. But I also have to applaud the leadership of the Little Rock Nine in 1957. I have to applaud the young students who protested the condition, the deplorable conditions of the elementary and secondary schools that led to the Supreme Court handing down its decision. And I would just reference one young lady in particular. Her name was Barbara John. At the age of 16, she led a protest at the Robert Moton School in Farmsville, Virginia, that contributed to the Supreme Court handing down the decision in 1954. We find that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Miss Barbara John has been memorialized with a bronze statue on the grounds of the Capitol of the state of Virginia in Richmond. So we cannot talk about where we are and where we might go without not looking at them in the context of what those brave men and women, boys and girls have done in the past. We can never, shall never dishonor their legacies and their contributions. George, as I mentioned, spent 35 years with the National Park Service, came on permanently with the Park Service in 1966 in the national office. This was merely 2 years after President Johnson signed the broad sweeping legislation that we know today as the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And that act, when signed into law, permitted me in my home state of Texas, a staunchly segregated state, to enter the front door of a small cafe where my mother served as a short order cook. Prior to then, I could only be served by entering the back door. So you could imagine that after the signing of the 64 the Civil Rights Act, that the federal government was trying to get its act together to live up to the letter and the spirit of the 64 Civil Rights Act. The Secretary of the Interior, who was responsible for my appointment in Grand Teton, the late Stuart Lee Udall, appointed a very dynamic director of the National Park Service, a native son of South Carolina, George B. Hartsog Jr., perhaps one of the more dynamic, legendary, visionary directors in the annals of the history of the National Park Service. And George, even though coming out of a segregated society similar to yours truly, he fully, directly, and wholeheartedly embraced the letter and the spirit of the Civil Rights Act of '64. He directed that his staff from South Pacific to Maine, from Alaska to the U.S. Virgin Islands, change their way of conducting their business, engage minority communities in delivery of their service and program, increase the number of contracts awarded to minorities, hire more women and African Americans. At that time, George, was still called Negroes, in your workforce, hire more Hispanics, more Native Americans, American Indians, if you will. And George did that. And he said, when we have parks in urban environments, like in Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Georgia, Philadelphia, New York, San Francisco, we want to make sure that our services are available to those young people who are living in these highly density areas. Reach out to them, invite them to come into parks. In some instances, provide transportation for them to come into parks. Also, the Park Service should look at the possibilities of encouraging Congress to create new parks that would be in close proximity to these urban centers. where the people could readily get into the parks as to having to save up maybe hundreds or thousands of dollars to get a train fare or bus fare out to Glacier or to Yosemite or to Yellowstone. So there was a great push on the part of Director Hartzell to increase the relevancy, if you will, of parks and park programs to all of America. It's interestingly, George, if I may personalize my association with Director Hartzell. When I came into the Washington office in 1966 as a GS9, and most of our interns I trust are familiar with that grade structure, I was the highest ranking Negro in the Park Service in the national office. And the highest ranking African American in the National Park Service in 1966 was a native son of Mississippi, Delmar Robinson, who was in financial management in then what we call the Western region in San Francisco. So I have seen upfront and personal from which the Park Service has come and where we are today. Further to my experiences in Grand Teton in 1962, there were only 2 areas in the national park system that had been authorized by an act of Congress to commemorate the enduring contributions of African Americans. George Washington Carver's birthplace on a plantation in Missouri, the birthplace of Booker T. Washington on a plantation in Virginia. And Congress in 1960 authorized the National Council of Negro Women to conduct planning, raise money to support the design and the ultimate erection of a memorial to one of America's greatest daughters, who is a founder of an outstanding HBCU. And I speak of none other than Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. And that statue, which stands roughly about 3 blocks from the nation's capital, was dedicated in 1974. But I often say, George, and I'll wrap up on this point, maybe. I often said that my Mr. Douglas, my Mr. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey Douglas, and I met the National Park Service in the same year. And people say, hey, Bob, I know you're old, but I didn't know you were that old. The point is, George, that I first worked as a seasonal in 62, donning the green and gray in June. On September 5, 1962, President John F. Kennedy signed a bill into public law authorizing the Frederick Douglass Home as a unit of the National Park System. And over a period of time before it became a unit of the park system, it had deteriorated and what have you. But it is now a symbol of dignity, of freedom and justice. And Mr. Douglas's unwavering fight for freedom for all. And it stands proudly in Southeast Washington on what Mr. Douglas referred to as Cedar Hill. But to get a little bit more personal than that, George, in 1970, while I was serving as a management assistant, Director Hartzell and his regional director for the National Capital Region, who interestingly enough was my chief ranger when I served as a seasonal ranger in Grand Teton, who ultimately became a director of the Park Service himself, Russell E. Dickerson. And George looked at the profile of all the superintendents in 1970 throughout the National Park Service and did not see one of our magnificent, beautiful hue, the black, brown skin. So based on the recommendation of my old chief ranger, George Hartzell said, Bob, you'll become our first Negro superintendent. And George, that was in 1970. Sad commentary, isn't it, that in 1903, 13 years before there was a National Park Service. A distinguished member of our fraternity. He was not a member at that time, but he was a captain in the U.S. Cavalry, was the superintendent of Secor National Park in California. At that time, Captain Charles Reynolds retired as a colonel. So I've seen the road over which we travel, and I know that any progress that I've made throughout my career, it would not have been possible without the sacrifices and the help of so many that gave me the opportunity. And I have a sense of indebtedness to those who are currently in the ranks.
So in 1976, our country celebrated the 200th year of the bicentennial of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And that year was a very pivotal year for the National Park Service because it was this commission, this bicentennial commission that was developed. And I know you work with the legendary DeForest brothers, and some of that work involved studies and plans and demands for more sites that commemorated the contributions of African Americans to the United States of America. Could you maybe expound upon how that commission was developed, the work that you did with Vince and his brother, and what came out of that commission and how we're benefiting today?
Thank you very much, Joyce. There's no question that the DeForest brothers, Robert and Vince, outstanding contributions of which we benefit today, probably started in the 1970 or 71. Bob and Vince came up with the idea of establishing a organization or a corporation that would join with the leadership of those who had the responsibility of planning events commemorating the 200th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And they knew that within the national park system, as well as other federal programs, there was not the representation of the richness of the African-American experience. So they established a corporation called the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation. And they developed a proposal which they discussed with the leadership of the Congressional Black Caucus and got 100% buy-in. And they spoke with a number of people that how can we go about maybe getting a federal commitment to support such a contract, such a study. And lo and behold, the timing was just right, because there was this receptive director of the Park Service, whom I had mentioned earlier, by the name of George B. Hartzog Jr. And they made a pitch to Director Hartzog and his leadership team. And Director Hartzog bought into it. And I don't know how they maneuvered it, but I think it might have been a non-competitive contract, Those things can be worked out. But in the final analysis, Bob and Vince received a substantial contract. And they convened the most distinguished, or one of the most distinguished panels of historians in African-American history that I have ever known, ever experienced. And out of the whole effort, to make a long story short, they developed a study plan that resulted in the nominations of no less than 60 sites that may ultimately be considered as future units of the park system. But the first approach would be, let's not try to bite off the whole apple tree, let's bite maybe just the apple and come up with a recommendation that some of these areas should at least be recognized for their national significance through the designation as National Historic Landmarks. And Vince and I exchanged email. We lost, unfortunately, Bob 8 or 10 years ago, but Vince and I stay in touch. He lives now in Missouri. There perhaps is no less than 20 areas now in the national park system under the full responsibility of the National Park Service that grew out of the nomination and the designation of National Historic Landmark. As an example, Maggie Lena Walker in Richmond, Virginia, and Dr. Carter G. Woodson Home in Washington. Initially, he was recognized as a National Historic Landmark. Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site in Tuskegee, Alabama. All of those grew out of the initiative of Bob and Vince DeForest, and their legacy endures, and we're all in their debt. And I'll segue into, well, let me just sort of back up. I was the Deputy Regional Director in the Southeast region during the real kickoff of some of the programs and developments under the national commemoration of the 200th anniversary. And the focus, in my judgment at that time, was seemingly in upgrading historical sites that related specifically to the Revolutionary War. And it surprised some people that there were Revolutionary War sites in South Carolina, as an example, but most obviously in New England and the Southeast. So there was a lot of focus on brick and mortar, if you will, as opposed to re-examining what we mean when we talk about freedom and dignity for all, not only under the Declaration of Independence, but under the Constitution. This celebration for 2026, the 250th anniversary, there is a shifting of focus, not so much of brick and mortar, that will be accomplished as well, but to re-examine where we have, to what extent we have delivered as a people in the nations on the promises that we made, not only in the Declaration of Independence, because when that was written, in my judgment, it was not addressed to us. We were still enslaved, and by the Dred Scott decision, we were not even people, so to speak. But we as in the United States of America, we made some substantial promises. Now, we made some guarantees in our Constitution, and I often reflect on the 14th Amendment, which says equal protection, equal protection of the laws. So what has been focused on today by those in the leadership role in trying to determine how we can best commemorate, in some instances we'll celebrate, but commemorate where we have come from 1776 up until 2026. How have we really lived up to we the people? How have we lived up to equal protection of the law? Why there is so much disparity in healthcare, education? The criminal justice system is in total disarray. So I applaud the Black Lives Movement, arguing that we made these commitments. When in the heck are we going to live up to them? And that's what's being re-examined today. And I'm privileged and humbled and honored to be a member of the 250th Commission Task Force on Parks, Preservation, and Public Places. And I'm trying to echo my voices. Let's re-examine where we are as a people and where we might go, because there are some injustices that we need to address. Yeah, we need to upgrade our Revolutionary War parks and acquaint people more with the lettering of the Declaration of Independence, but let us live up to our commitment. Again, George, you allow me to reference my Mr. Douglas again. Mr. Douglas said in 1893, 2 years before his death, that there's no Negro problem. The problem is whether the American people have the patriotism enough, have the loyalty enough, have the courage enough to live up to their own Constitution. That's what we should be all about. Where in the heck are we going to get courage to deliver on what we promised? Equal protection of the laws. My sermonette for the day, George.
And as the old folks would say, amen.
Oh, man. And pass the plate.
Yes. So I know we have some questions from our interns, and Lauren will be the first question for Mr. Stanton.
As she's crafting her question, I'd be remiss, I could not go back to Houston Tillotson if I did not applaud my fellow intern at Mount Rainier in Washington State from the home of the Rams, Houston Tillotson University. Thanks again,
Yes.
George.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you for your words. And we do have a question in the chat already from Hugh. Hugh's question is, what was your experience at Teton like in '62 and your relationship with the staff?
That's a very fine question.
Yeah.
Just a little background on this. When Secretary Udall came into office, he was appointed by President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson. He was really just a kid himself. I think President Kennedy must have been 43 when he was elected, and Stuart Udall, I think, was 41. But Stuart Udall is one of the two most legendary secretaries in our history. He and his brother Mo Udall were very active in civil rights, trying to integrate the University of Arizona. And they were successful in integrating the cafeteria, as an example. And when he came into office, and this during the height of student protests, demonstrations in the streets by college students and others, and Dr. King, et cetera, he looked at the workforce and said, I don't see the face of America. I don't see the same young Negroes that are marching, working for me in the parks at the field. And he said, I'm going to change this. I'm going to change this now. And I could just imagine that some of the old bureaucrats in his office would say, you're going to do what? And he did it. But he had strategized. He had selected X number of recruiters to go into select number of historically Black colleges and met with the president of these colleges. It's a new day. We have not been on your campuses before, but we want you, Madam President and Mr. President, recommend students whom you feel that could represent you well, represent the university well, represent their community well, and most importantly, represent me, the Secretary of the Interior, and President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson well, because I want to do this. And for all of those who accepted that opportunity, I think there was roughly 40 to 50 of us, we received a personal letter signed by the Secretary, confirming in my instance a seasonal GS4 Ranger in Grand Teton. And that's one of my prized possessions, is the original letter that hangs in my library. So the Park Service did not have any say-so about African Americans coming into the workforce the summer of 1962. The Secretary of the Interior told the Park Service, you're going to have Negro Rangers, period. So some of the fellow seasonal rangers who may have worked in Yosemite or in Yellowstone or elsewhere, they were merely accommodated or tolerated, if you will, by the staff. And that could have happened similarly to the three of us African Americans who worked in Teton in '62. But that was not the case. And I often reflect on that someone blessed me, prayed for me, and that the caliber or the quality of the professionalism on the part of the career staff in Grand Teton really inspired me to ultimately maybe seek a career opportunity with the National Park Service. And to give you some idea of the quality of the people whom I interacted with on a daily basis in Grand Teton. My assistant chief ranger became an associate director for management and operation, at that time considered the third level position, higher level position in the National Park Service. My superintendent from '62 became the number 2 of all of the National Park Service. And my chief ranger, whom I had referenced earlier, became a director of the National Park Service. And they accepted the three of us in the workforce of Grand Teton. Had I gone to another park and had an experience that you're here because the secretary said you're going to be here and not benefit from the mentoring, from the guidance, from the counseling, what have you, I probably would have said the H with the Park Service, but that was not the case. And that was not the case. But and as I said, that was 2 years before the Civil Rights Act of '64. And we were denied services in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And after we let the leadership of the park know, the superintendent, the chief ranger, assistant ranger, they apparently spoke with the town fathers, and we had no problem subsequently in being served in Jackson, Wyoming.
And I believe that you served in Tetons with Joy Kennard's uncle, right?
Yeah, well, yes, George. I was going to mention that. Oh, yes. Teton was the beginning of so many chapters in my life. There were three of us African Americans in Teton at that time. One of my fellow students, classmates from Houston-Tillotson, Mishaw, and the other one was William Douglas Kennard, who was also finishing his junior year at Livingstone College in Salisbury, South Carolina. And make a long story short, when I came to Washington, D.C. in '66 to accept my first permanent job, I was a bachelor, William was a bachelor, and he said, "Hey, Bob, go live with me and my family," because he was a native son of Washington. And I said, "Fine." He said, "Oh, by the way, Bob, there's a young lady just finished from Livingstone. She's working at HUD. It was in '66. Why don't we double date?" I said, "Hell, you know, William, I'm open, man. Let's do it." Next darn thing I know, he was my best man, and his brother was administering the wedding oath. And I still called him my friend. But anyway, the minister was Joy Kennard's father, the late Reverend John Kennard, the first African-American to serve as a museum director in the Smithsonian. He was the founder and director of the Anacostia Museum. Yeah, so the Kennards family and the Teton connections have been with me going almost 60 years, George. And Joy wasn't even born when I first met her father.
Yeah.
And I'm very proud of Joy, the distinguished alum of Livingstone and Howard University.
Yeah.
Let me just throw in a little bit more history here, and for those who really want to understand the road over which we have traveled and the role that graduates of HBCUs have played in trying to redirect interior. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was appointed, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt appointed his Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, in 1933, he appointed an advisor for Negro affairs. The first one was Robert Weaver, Dr. Robert Weaver, who ultimately became the first African-American to serve in a cabinet level position as the Secretary of HUD, appointed by Johnson. And his successor was William Trent Jr. Look up that name, William Trent Jr., whose father was the president of Livingstone, and William Trent Jr. was a graduate of Livingstone. And he was very influential, working with Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, with Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, with the leadership of NAACP. They convinced Harold Ickes that he should take a strong approach in making sure that parks and park facilities and programs were available irrespective of one's race or color. He set that all into motion before he left Interior in 1944. I'm going to test the history of some of my HBCU alums here. Many of you attended United Negro College Fund, funded HBCU. But Trent served for 20 years as the president of the United Negro College Fund. But he was so influential that in 1945, Hear this, my friends. In 1945, Secretary Harold Ickes issued a secretarial proclamation outlawing the segregation and discrimination in national parks. So if I had gone to Shenandoah National Park, would have been a mere youngster in diapers, obviously, so young. But if I had gone to Shenandoah National Park before 1945, I would see a sign that would say campground for colored, campground for white. After 1945, that did not exist. And that decision by Harold Ickes was influenced by a graduate of an HBCU, William Trent Jr. So that's, again, the road over which we have traveled. So it's up to us to build upon that legacy and continue to break down all kinds of barriers and injustices and inequities.
So, Lauren, do we have any more time? Because I know us Qs, we can keep talking all day long. This is some great stuff.
It is great stuff, and we're so enriched by it. Unfortunately, we are at time, and I could go on and listen for more too, but Ebony's gonna give me the little bell in just a moment and say you're doing too much. But it's definitely been one of the most enriching hours of our life. Thank you so much for your words.
I want to thank you, Ms. White, and certainly to our founding directors and presidents, Angela and James, and certainly George. Although I'm without portfolio, I do have a lot of thoughts, and George knows all too well that I'm a quotation junkie. But I think about the president of an HBCU who mentored a 16-year-old young person who 10 to 11 years later would not only be on the national, but on the international stage in fighting for justice and civil rights. And all of us know who that is. But Dr. Benjamin Mays, a native son of South Carolina, a brother to yours truly and George McDonald, reminded all of his students, and I will just share with you his wisdom, and I will leave this to our interns. The tragedy of life is not reaching your goal. The real tragedy of life is having no goal to reach. Not failure, but poor aim or low aim is a sin. So my friends, congratulations, I commend you, and continue to aim high. We owe it to our ancestors. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Your words are sitting deep in our hearts. Thank you for your time. Thank you, George, for moderating our session. Dr. Stanton, I'm sure there were many, many more acknowledgements and thank yous to give from our students, as well as from the staff that is on hand today. We also want to say, we wish you to continue imparting these words to groups like ours. We know you've retired and failed that, but we appreciate your failure because it allows us to continue to be enriched by your words. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, and I'm always here for you.
Absolutely, absolutely. So at this time, we're going to wrap up this particular session. Oh, I'm sorry, Ernestine, you had something?
No, Gina had a request. She wanted to know about the quote. I was just hoping that he could provide the name.
That's from Dr. Benjamin Mays, the preeminent president of Morehouse College. And he was the president at the time that Martin Luther King Jr. entered his freshman class at the age of either 15 or 16.
Thank
Excellent,
you.
excellent.
Mhm.
We appreciate that. We are transitioning to lunch, and I realize that we're just a little bit over time on lunch, but I think that it was time well spent. You should all have received indication via email of your lunch allotment through Grubhub. We are acquiring lunch through Grubhub and placing orders. You have a $20 limit, and you have till 6 p.m. to use it. So don't feel as if you are not able to do this in this particular hour.